The fire flickers against stone walls. Incense thickens the air. Shadows stretch across ancient pillars. A trembling man kneels before a veiled figure, her eyes unseen behind a golden mask. He has come for answers, not from a human, but from a god, or at least that's what he believes. Because in the heart of ancient Greece, truth was not spoken by reason. It was sold in whispers. And those whispers came from the Oracle of Delphi, a woman who claimed to speak for Apollo himself. Her words could crown kings, start wars, or destroy empires. But behind the veil of divinity, there hid something more human, more fragile, and far more dangerous. Power, greed, and manipulation. This is the story of how a simple idea, the promise that God speaks through people, became one of the oldest and greatest scams in human history. A scam not born of lies alone, but of faith, politics, and the eternal human hunger for certainty. Because when people fear the unknown, they will pay anything to hear what they want to believe. The Oracle's temple was built on a fault line, where the earth itself seemed alive. Gas leaked from the rocks, sweet, dizzying fumes that made the Pythia, the priestess, fall into trance. To the Greeks, it was the breath of Apollo, divine intoxication. To modern science, it was ethylene, a hallucinogenic gas that made vision seem real. But to the priests of Delphi, it was an opportunity. They turned geology into theology, and hallucination into a business. No prophecy came cheap. Wealthy leaders, generals, and even philosophers would travel across mountains, bringing gold, livestock, and rare offerings. Each question cost a fortune, and the answers, always vague, always poetic, could be twisted to fit any outcome. If a king asked, "Should I go to war?" the oracle would say, "A great empire will fall." But whose empire? His or his enemies? Either way, the priests would win, because ambiguity was their weapon, and belief their shield. The oracle's power grew. Delphi became the spiritual capital of Greece. Its priests advised rulers, influenced politics, and even decided where colonies were founded. They were not just interpreters of gods. They were the silent manipulators of nations. Through riddles and fumes, they controlled human destiny. But here's the chilling part. This wasn't just superstition. It was psychology. A masterclass in human persuasion centuries before Freud or propaganda. The priests understood human weakness, our craving for meaning, our fear of uncertainty. They gave answers wrapped in mystery. Because people trust what they don't understand. When it feels divine, the oracle's scam worked not because it fooled fools, but because it comforted thinkers. Even the smartest minds of Socrates, Plato, respected Delphi. That's the brilliance of manipulation. The most effective lies aren't shouted. They're whispered, wrapped in truth. And so, for centuries, the Oracle of Delphi reigned supreme, a living embodiment of divine authority, and a perfectly engineered scam, one that made faith profitable and ignorance sacred. A place where psychology met power, and power disguised itself as prophecy. But what happens when the whisper of gods becomes the roar of men? When the same trick that controls kings begins to threaten them? The scam that built empires soon began to tear them apart. Because the moment power learns it can deceive others, it forgets how easily it can deceive itself. In the heart of the Greek mountains, far from the chaos of city walls and politics, a quiet machine was at work. Not a machine of iron or steam, but one built from minds, myths, and manipulation. It ran not on gears but on belief. And it was tended not by engineers but by priests, scholars, and storytellers who knew one eternal truth. People will worship what they do not understand. If you give it a sacred name, the priests of Delphi mastered this truth. They didn't just sell answers. They built a system where questions themselves became currency. Every visitor, from soldiers to philosophers, entered through rituals of awe. You were bathed, purified, dressed in laurel, and guided through halls where every torch flicker felt like a heartbeat of a god. By the time you reached the oracle, your mind was already prepared to believe. It wasn't trickery. It was theater. A stage designed to make reality blur just enough to let faith slip in. The Pythia, the woman who spoke for Apollo, was chosen young. She lived in seclusion, fasting and praying until her mind blurred between vision and dream. When she inhaled the sacred vapors, her words came in fragments, broken phrases, whispers, sometimes screams. The priest would translate them, but translation meant transformation, because in that gap between madness and meaning, truth could be edited, reshaped, and sold. What began as gas and hallucination became prophecy. What began as poetry became power. This was the machinery of Delphi, layer upon layer of ritual, emotion, and performance. A perfect psychological loop. First, they isolated you, then overwhelmed you, then delivered a truth you could never verify, and you would thank them for it. That's the genius of belief. It doesn't need proof. It only needs purpose, but make no mistake. This was no random superstition. It was an industry. Every oracle session brought gold, livestock, and offerings. Every prophecy funded temples, festivals, and monuments that shouted the oracle's importance across Greece. The priests even controlled who could ask what. Some questions were denied, others delayed. The line between divine will and political censorship blurred. Delphi became less a temple of truth and more a ministry of narrative. And that's where the real brilliance of this ancient system lies. The priests didn't just manipulate kings, they manipulated the story of power itself. They made it seem that Apollo spoke through them, when in reality they spoke for those who paid most. Generals sought approval before battle. City-states sought blessings for expansion. The oracle became the divine stamp of legitimacy. And whoever controlled that stamp, controlled Greece. Yet behind all this grandeur, there was a quieter, darker insight. Faith can be industrialized. Hope can be monetized. And when you combine fear, mystery, and authority, you create something stronger than armies or obedience. This wasn't about religion. It was about influence. It taught rulers how to control with symbols instead of swords. Because once a man believes his fate is written by gods, he stops questioning those who claim to interpret it. The oracle's power wasn't in her visions. It was in her silence, the way she let others fill the gaps with meaning that suited their desires. Every vague prophecy became a mirror, reflecting what the listener already wanted to hear. And so the system thrived, because the greatest illusions are not built on lies. They are built on the truths we desperately wish were real. That's what made the oracle untouchable. It wasn't fear, it was reverence. People wanted to believe that God still cared, that chaos still had meaning, that destiny could still be negotiated. The priests understood this human hunger, the need for order in a world of uncertainty, the craving for control in the face of chaos. So they gave it form, wrapped it in ritual, music, incense, and gold, until faith itself became the most valuable commodity in Greece. But machines, no matter how sacred, always break, especially when their gears start grinding against ambition. As the centuries passed, the oracle's influence grew too large. Kings began to use it not for guidance but for propaganda. And soon, the machine of belief started feeding on itself. When power becomes addicted to its own myth, collapse is inevitable. The oracle began as a voice of the gods, but soon it became the mouthpiece of kings. And like all power that starts in faith and ends in politics, it learned how to serve whoever could pay the highest price. By the 6th century BCE, Greece was not one nation, but a collection of city-states, each fighting for power, pride, and divine favor. Every ruler wanted Apollo on their side, and Delphi became the courtroom where history's outcomes were negotiated. Not by armies, but by words wrapped in mystery. The oracle's words were never neutral. They were tools, sharpened by priests who understood that influence was the purest form of control. A single phrase could decide the fate of thousands, and the right prophecy could justify a war, a conquest, even a massacre, all while keeping the blood off divine hands. One of the earliest examples was Croesus, the king of Lydia, a man of immense wealth and pride. He asked the oracle whether he should attack Persia. The answer came dripping in ambiguity. If you cross the river, a great empire will fall. Croesus smiled, believing it meant his enemy's doom. But when his own empire crumbled, he realized too late. The oracle had never lied. It had simply refused to tell the truth. This was Delphi's perfection. Never be wrong, only misunderstood, and that's how it ruled over minds. By crafting sentences that bent with interpretation, each listener hearing what he needed to hear, each ruler convinced that Apollo was on his side. Soon, prophecy became the ancient version of propaganda. Before newspapers, before media, there was the Oracle, delivering the divine version of political PR. When Athens wanted legitimacy for its colonies, the Oracle blessed the voyages. When Sparta sought dominance, Delphi's voice echoed with approval. When Thebes rebelled, the gods conveniently sided with whoever could offer more tribute. Gold spoke louder than piety, and the priests of Delphi listened closely. Yet beneath the sacred marble and incense, the oracle's operations resembled the machinery of modern influence. The priests gathered intelligence. They listened to travelers, merchants, spies. They knew who was rising, who was falling. So when prophecy was spoken, it often sounded divine. Because it was informed, they turned information into revelation, politics into religion, and speculation into sacred truth. It's easy to dismiss these oracles as primitive superstition, but look closely, and you'll see the same design repeating through history. The church, the court, the media, each era builds its own oracle, each claiming to speak truth from higher authority, each feeding the same hunger, certainty in an uncertain world. The oracle's greatest trick wasn't deception, it was persuasion through ambiguity. Psychologists today call it the Barnum effect, the ability of vague statements to feel personally meaningful. When people hear something uncertain yet profound, they fill in the blanks with their own desires. The oracle didn't predict the future. It let people imagine one that felt divine, and kings loved it. Because prophecy gave them something politics never could: legitimacy. If the gods wanted a war, then conquest wasn't ambition. It was destiny. If the gods favored a ruler, rebellion became blasphemy. The oracle's words turned greed into righteousness, and power into divine order. Delphi became so influential that wars were delayed until the oracle approved them. Empires sought her blessing before coronations. Even philosophers like Socrates bowed before her reputation. When he was declared the wisest man in Greece, he doubted it, but millions didn't. That single prophecy immortalized his legacy. Once again, the oracle proved that perception, not truth, writes history, but every illusion grows too large to contain. When the oracle's influence began threatening rulers instead of serving them, its own protection crumbled. In time, rival powers began to see it not as a divine mouthpiece, but as a dangerous institution of manipulation. And the same kings who once worshipped Delphi now plotted its downfall. The Roman general Nero, paranoid and cruel, accused the oracle of conspiracy. Others banned consultations altogether. By the time Christianity rose, prophecy was declared heresy, and the once holy voice of Apollo faded into silence. The temple fell into ruin, the sacred vapors dried, and yet, the idea that people can be controlled by belief never died. Because every empire builds its own Delphi, every age finds its priests. Every generation kneels before a new oracle, sometimes in temples, sometimes in screens, sometimes in the quiet voice that says, "This is the truth because someone powerful said so." Every empire begins with a story. Every story begins with a belief. And every belief begins with a human need. The oracle didn't survive for centuries because it was clever. It survived because humanity was desperate to be told that their suffering meant something. In a world of chaos, death, and uncertainty, prophecy offered the illusion of order, a pattern in the storm, a voice that said, "You are part of a plan." And that single sentence was more powerful than any army. We like to think of ourselves as rational, but the truth is, humans are meaning-making creatures. We fear the unknown more than we fear pain. And when faced with uncertainty, we don't look for facts, we look for comfort. The oracle understood this long before psychology gave it names. Cognitive bias, confirmation bias, narrative fallacy, all existed long before Freud or Kahneman. They were simply wrapped in smoke, ritual, and divine language. When Croesus asked if he should wage war, He wasn't seeking strategy. He was seeking validation. He wanted the gods to echo what his ambition already whispered. And when the oracle's words could mean anything, he chose the meaning that served his desire. That's how belief works. It's never about truth. It's about comfort. We cling to the stories that make our fears manageable, our failures meaningful, our suffering sacred. Psychologists call this the illusion of control. The brain's tendency to believe it can predict or influence outcomes. It's the same instinct that makes gamblers chase losses, that makes people check horoscopes, that makes nations follow leaders who promise certainty. Even when their certainty leads to ruin, the oracle then wasn't just a temple. It was humanity's mirror, reflecting back everything people already wanted to believe. The priests didn't need to invent lies. They only needed to amplify human desire. And this is where manipulation becomes effortless, because the best way to control someone is not to lie to them. It's to give them a story where their own fears do the lying. Once you convince people that destiny is on their side, they'll destroy themselves believing it's victory. Think of how modern oracles have evolved. We no longer burn incense. We scroll screens. We no longer climb mountains for answers. We type them into search bars. We no longer wait for Apollo's whispers. We wait for algorithms. And yet the psychology hasn't changed. We still crave certainty. We still worship prediction. We still mistake confidence for truth. In every age, there are new prophets, financial gurus predicting markets, influencers predicting happiness, politicians predicting safety. They all use the same psychological trick: speak in ambiguity, wrap fear in authority, and let the audience do the rest. Even modern cults of personality follow the same structure. A charismatic figure, a promise of meaning, a narrative of us versus them. It's Delphi. You branded for the digital age. The human mind doesn't evolve as fast as our technology. We still carry the same tribal instincts, the same fear of randomness, the same need to belong to something larger, something divine. And manipulators, from ancient priests to modern propagandists, have always known how to weaponize that need. This is why skepticism is rare. It's easier to believe a beautiful lie than to confront a meaningless truth. Faith feels warm, doubt feels cold, and in the silence of uncertainty, even the wisest minds reach for comfort. Socrates once said, "I know that I know nothing." But that kind of humility is unbearable for most people. We don't want the truth. We want a truth we can live with. That's why prophets thrive and skeptics die forgotten. So when the oracle spoke, people didn't hear ambiguity. They heard hope when she said, "A great empire will fall." They heard, "My enemies will lose," when she said, "You will be great." They heard, "You will never suffer again." And that's how prophecy became self-fulfilling, not because it was divine, but because people shaped their lives to make it real in a way. The oracle's power was never about her. It was about us. Our hunger for control, our addiction to stories, our inability to live inside chaos without inventing a god to explain it. And maybe that's the darkest truth of all, that even if every temple burned, every priest vanished, every prophecy forgotten, we would still rebuild the oracle, because the need for belief is carved into our DNA. The same psychology that built Delphi built religions, built ideologies, built the modern cult of certainty. And as long as humans exist, there will always be someone, somewhere, selling meaning to those afraid of randomness. So perhaps the oracle never died. It simply moved. From the stones of Delphi, to the screens in our hands, from the whispers of priests, to the headlines and hashtags of the modern age. Still feeding the same need, to make sense of the senseless, to turn fear into faith, and chaos into prophecy. Centuries have passed. The marble has cracked, the incense has faded, but the oracle still speaks, only now. Her temple glows in pixels instead of firelight. Once people traveled miles to hear the gods. Now they scroll for prophecy, and every screen, every feed, every voice claiming to know is a new priest in digital robes. The names have changed. Priests became pundits. Temples became platforms. Oracles became algorithms. But the purpose remains unchanged. to shape belief, to direct emotion, to profit from human uncertainty. Just as the oracle once spoke in riddles, modern voices speak in algorithms, both designed to sound mysterious, both crafted to feel divine. When you log in, you step into a ritual, an invisible temple where you offer your attention, and in return you receive certainty, tailored, personal, convincing. It's not prophecy now, it's personalization, but it works on the same ancient instinct, our craving for control, our terror of randomness. The algorithm whispers, "This is what you believe. This is who you are. This is what you should fear." And we obey, not because it commands, but because it understands us too well. Like the oracle's smoke-filled chamber, the modern feed is designed to confuse and seduce, to drown you in voices until only one feels true, the one that confirms your world. The priests once studied faces. Now machines study patterns. They track your doubt, your anger, your loneliness, and feed it back to you as meaning. That's the modern magic, a new form of divination powered by data, a digital priesthood predicting desire instead of destiny, and behind every prediction lies a profit motive. Just as the Temple of Delphi thrived on donations and offerings, platforms thrive on engagement. Attention is the new gold. Emotion is the new currency. The oracle didn't die, she was monetized. Governments understood this first. Then corporations followed. Now every influencer, newsfeed, and truth teller plays the same psychological game. They don't sell facts, they sell belief. Because belief binds, belief divides, belief makes you predictable. The more predictable you are, the easier it is to control what you buy, what you vote for, what you hate, and what you never question. We've built a world of modern temples, news networks, political movements, celebrity cults, each promising enlightenment, each feeding on devotion. The oracle once claimed to speak for the gods. Now the gods speak through code, and their voice is louder, faster, endless. But here's the hidden cost. The same system that gives comfort also steals freedom. When everything you see reinforces your belief, you stop seeking truth, you stop doubting, you stop thinking. You become a follower in a digital religion, worshiping certainty, hating chaos, serving algorithms like unseen deities. The smoke hasn't vanished. It's just turned electric. And in its glow, we see the same story play out again. The story of control disguised as faith. History repeats not because we forget, but because our psychology never evolved past it. We are still standing in Delphi. Only this time the priest wears a headset, the altar is your screen, and the God you pray to knows your search history. What was once myth is now mechanism. What was once ritual is now routine. And what was once faith has become data. So perhaps the real prophecy was never about the future, but about us, that we would build our own cage and call it connection, that we would trade our souls for comfort and name it progress. Every age creates its own oracle. Every oracle sells the same promise. You don't have to face uncertainty. And every time, humanity believes her again. Because we don't want to be free, we want to be certain. And certainty, even when false, feels safer than truth. So the oracle lives on, not in stone, but in the circuitry of our need to believe. Her temple is everywhere, her voice endless, her prophecy eternal. As long as you fear chaos, you will need me. There was a time when mystery was sacred, when not knowing was beautiful, when the unknown inspired art instead of fear. But somewhere between temples and touchscreens, between priests and programmers, we lost the courage to wonder. We started treating uncertainty as a flaw, doubt as a weakness, and questions as threats. We forgot that every truth, every revolution, every spark of progress was born from doubt. Now we live in a world that sells answers, a marketplace of certainty, where every opinion feels final, and every voice claims truth. The oracle still whispers, but her tone has changed. She no longer speaks of gods or destiny. She speaks of trends, of engagement, of control. Her voice echoes through notifications. Her smoke glows on our screens. Her prophecies take the shape of headlines. And her temples exist inside our minds. She no longer tells us the future. She decides it, one click at a time. The tragedy is not that we are deceived. It's that we choose deception, because truth demands effort, and comfort feels easier than clarity. We scroll to escape thought. We consume to escape silence. We obey algorithms because they think for us. But in this obedience, we forget the essence of what it means to be human, to wonder, to question, to dream beyond what we're told. The Oracle thrives on our fear of chaos because chaos means possibility, and possibility cannot be monetized. Every time we surrender our curiosity, we give away a piece of our freedom. And every time we cling to certainty, we step closer to the death of wonder. But maybe, there's still time to remember that truth was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be discovered. The Oracle can only survive if we kneel, if we stop asking, if we forget how to listen to silence, because silence is dangerous to her. It breaks the rhythm of consumption. It allows thought to return. It allows wonder to breathe again. Imagine, for a moment, a world without constant answers. A world where mystery isn't something to solve, but something to experience. A world where you look at the stars, and instead of asking for meaning, you feel the infinite questions they hold. That is what we have lost. The awe of existence, the humility of not knowing. The ancients sought the divine in mystery, but we try to eliminate mystery. We measure it, label it, package it into data, and in doing so, we kill the very thing that made us human, because to wonder is to be alive. To question is to resist control, and to seek truth is to walk away from the Oracle. Maybe the Oracle will never die. Maybe she will always evolve. From temple to throne, from screen to chip, from belief to code. But as long as there is one mind that chooses curiosity over certainty, one voice that asks why instead of how much, one heart that dares to sit in silence, she cannot win. Freedom does not come from knowing, it comes from wondering. And wonder is rebellion. So when the Oracle calls, when the feed flashes, when certainty feels warm and easy, pause, breathe. Remember the long chain of believers who came before you. From Delphi to Rome, from pulpits to platforms, all searching for the same thing, a voice that tells them they are right. And remember that every empire built on certainty eventually crumbled under its own illusion. So maybe the lesson was never about the Oracle or the gods or the algorithms. Maybe it was about us, our hunger for control, our fear of the unknown, our inability to sit in the dark and still feel safe. The Oracle wins only when we stop wondering, when we stop questioning, when we stop seeing through the fog. But the moment you look at the screen and whisper, "I don't believe you," you break the spell. You become what humanity was always meant to be, a seeker, not a follower. And maybe that's where salvation hides. Not in answers, but in the courage to ask again. The Oracle fades, her smoke thins, the glow of the screen softens, and what remains is silence. The kind that feels like truth. The kind that feels like freedom, because the death of wonder was never inevitable. It was a choice, and it can still be undone. All it takes is a single thought, a single uncomfortable, beautiful question.